Captain Kyle Morrison stood on the bridge of the New Dawn watching the stars through the main screen when the emergency signal came through the communication system, a distress call unlike anything he had heard before because it carried strange patterns and frequencies that made his equipment work harder than usual to decode the message, and Lieutenant Jake Collins turned from his station with wide eyes as he announced that the signal was not coming from any human ship or station but from something else entirely. Something that had never been seen before in all the years that humans had been traveling through space around their solar system. The signal led them to a location near Jupiter where they found a ship that looked like nothing any human had ever built. Its hull was made of materials that seemed to shift color in the light, and its design followed curves and angles that human engineers would never think to use. And Captain Morrison ordered his crew to move closer even though every safety protocol told him to stay away from unknown vessels. But the distress signal was getting weaker, and that meant whatever was inside that strange ship was running out of time. Commander Lisa Brooks took charge of the rescue operation with the same calm voice she used for every emergency, directing the crew to prepare the airlocks and emergency equipment while she studied the alien ship through the sensors, trying to understand how they could safely make contact without causing damage to either vessel. And she noticed that the ship was losing power quickly, which meant they had only minutes to act before it would be too late to save anyone inside the rescue. Took 3 hours of careful work as the human crew used their tools and experience to cut through the alien hull without causing decompression. And when they finally made it inside, they found 3 beings that looked nothing like humans but were clearly intelligent and afraid, their large eyes reflecting the emergency lights as Kyle Morrison and his team worked to get them to safety, using hand signals and simple sounds to show that they meant no harm. The alien beings wore clothes that seemed to be made of the same shifting material as their ship, and they moved in ways that showed they were not used to the gravity and atmosphere that humans needed to survive. But the human crew adapted quickly and found ways to help them breathe and move more easily, and the largest of the aliens, who seemed to be their leader, kept making sounds that might have been words in a language that no human had ever heard. Before Jay Collins spent hours working with the alien communication devices, trying to understand how they worked and how to make the translation systems function properly, and slowly he began to pick up patterns in their speech, learning that the leader was called something like Nexus Prime, and that he was very important in whatever civilization these beings came from, and that they were grateful beyond measure for the rescue even though they could not understand why the humans had risked their own safety to help complete strangers when the alien ship was finally secure and the beings were safe aboard the New Dawn. Nexus Prime tried to offer payment for the rescue in the form of strange crystals that seemed to contain more energy than anything humans had ever seen. But Captain Morrison refused the payment and tried to explain through gestures and the basic translation that Jake had managed to set up that humans did not require payment for helping others in need, which seemed to confuse and amaze the alien ambassador more than anything else that had happened. The first real conversation took place in the ship's main meeting room where Nexus Prime sat across from the human officers and tried to understand their motivations, asking through the improving translation system why they had risked their ship and their lives to save beings they had never seen before. And Captain Morrison answered simply that it was the right thing to do, that any intelligent being in distress deserved help regardless of what species they belonged to or what they could offer in return. This answer seemed to shock Nexus Prime more than the rescue itself, and he spent a long time asking questions about human society and culture, trying to understand how a species could survive and develop advanced technology while still helping others without expecting immediate rewards. And he learned that humans had many different governments and groups, but they all seemed to share this strange idea that helping others was more important than gaining resources or power. Over the next several days, as they traveled toward the aliens' home region of space, Nexus Prime taught the humans about the Galactic Council, a government that included dozens of different species spread across thousands of worlds, all working together under strict rules about trade and resource management. And he explained that humans would be invited to join this council if they proved themselves worthy through the proper channels and procedures. But the more Nexus Prime learned about humans, the more he realized that they would not fit easily into the careful structure that the Galactic Council had built over thousands of years, because humans seemed to make decisions based on strange ideas about right and wrong rather than simple calculations about benefit and cost, and they treated strangers like family members and were willing to sacrifice their own comfort to help others even when there was no logical reason to do so. When they finally reached the edge of council space, and other ships came to escort Nexus Prime home, He sent a message ahead that would soon reach every important leader in the galaxy. A message that described the rescue and the humans who had performed it. And he warned that these new beings were unlike any species the Council had encountered before, because they seemed to care more about the welfare of others than they did about their own survival. And this made them either the most dangerous or the most valuable species the galaxy had ever seen. The Galactic Council's survey team Alpha 7 approached Earth with the standard equipment for evaluating new worlds. Their sensors designed to measure atmosphere, gravity, and biological diversity on what they expected to be another normal planet suitable for intelligent life. But Thraxian xenobiologist Kethvua began to notice unusual readings long before their ship entered Earth's solar system. Readings that suggested this world was far more active and dangerous than any planet that had ever produced a civilization. Dr. Ben Carter welcomed the alien survey team at the International Space Station with enthusiasm and pride, eager to show off humanity's homeworld to beings from advanced civilizations, but he noticed immediately that the aliens needed special equipment just to survive in the station's environment, their breathing apparatus and gravity adjusters working constantly to keep them comfortable in conditions that humans considered normal and safe. The first shock came when Kethvua measured Earth's gravity, and found it to be nearly twice the standard that most Council species had evolved to handle. And when he asked Dr. Carter how humans had developed space travel while living under such crushing force, the human scientist seemed confused by the question and explained that Earth's gravity was simply normal for them, and that their bodies had grown strong enough to handle it without any difficulty. Amy Foster, Earth's lead biologist, guided the survey team through detailed scans of the planet's surface, and with each new measurement the aliens became more silent and worried, because Earth's atmospheric pressure would crush most Council species without protection, and the weather systems that humans called normal would be classified as extreme disasters on any civilized world, with storms that could destroy cities and temperature changes that would kill unprepared visitors in minutes. When the survey team requested to observe Earth's biological systems directly, Amy took them to see a simple forest ecosystem, and the aliens watched in horror as she walked calmly among creatures that their sensors classified as dangerous predators, pointing out bears and wolves and venomous snakes as if they were harmless neighbors. And when Kethvua asked why she was not afraid, Amy laughed and explained that humans had lived alongside these animals for thousands of years. The revelation that humans actually consumed many of Earth's plants and animals became even more disturbing when the aliens ran chemical analyzers and discovered that much of the human diet consisted of substances that would be toxic or deadly to 90% of known galactic species. And Dr. Carter had to explain that humans had evolved to process alcohol, caffeine, capsaicin, and dozens of other compounds that most aliens would consider dangerous poisons. Captain Ryan Hayes volunteered to show the survey team what humans did for recreation, and he took them to observe a hiking expedition in the Rocky Mountains, where they watched in stunned silence as humans climbed vertical rock faces using only ropes and metal tools. Their bodies adapted to an environment that would kill most galactic citizens within hours. And when Kethvua asked why they chose to do such dangerous activities for pleasure, Ryan simply said that it was fun and made them feel alive. The survey team's growing alarm reached a peak when they observed human children playing in conditions that would require emergency protective equipment on most worlds, running and jumping and swimming in ways that demonstrated incredible physical durability, and Amy Foster had to explain that human children were actually more fragile than adults, which made the aliens question how any human survived to reach maturity on such a hostile world. Each day of the survey brought new evidence that Earth was unlike any world that had ever produced intelligent life, with natural disasters that occurred regularly and weather patterns that changed quickly and violently, and yet humans not only survived in this environment but seemed to thrive in it, building cities in areas that would be considered uninhabitable danger zones on any civilized planet. The alien scientists struggled to understand how a species could develop art, music, literature, and advanced technology while living under constant threat from their own environment. And Dr. Carter tried to explain that humans had always lived with danger and uncertainty, which had taught them to be adaptable and creative, in ways that might be different from species that had evolved on safer worlds. When Kethvua requested to observe human emergency response procedures, he was taken to see firefighters, paramedics, and rescue workers who regularly entered dangerous situations to help other humans. And he watched in amazement as these people ran toward fires and floods and collapsed buildings instead of away from them, risking their own lives to save others even when the odds of success were very low. Survey team's final report took weeks to compile because they had to create new classification categories that had never been needed before, and when they submitted their findings to the Galactic Council, the document contained measurements and observations that seemed impossible for a world that had produced space-traveling intelligence, leading to extensive review and verification before the Council would accept the results. The report's conclusion was unprecedented in galactic history, classifying Earth as a Death World Class 12, the highest danger rating ever assigned to a planet inhabited by intelligent life, and it recommended that any contact with humans should be conducted with extreme caution because they had evolved under conditions that would be immediately fatal to most. Council species news of the Death World classification spread quickly through galactic civilization, creating fear and fascination in equal measure as species that had never encountered a hostile environment tried to understand how humans had not only survived on Earth but had developed enough technology to travel between stars, and military analysts began to study the implications of contact with beings who considered deadly environments to be normal. Galactic Council's Xenopsychology Department issued warnings that humans might not respond to threats and negotiations in predictable ways because they had evolved under constant pressure from their environment, which could make them more aggressive, more adaptively, or more willing to take risks than any species the galaxy had encountered before. But perhaps most disturbing to the established order was the realization that if humans could thrive on a world that would kill most galactic citizens, they might be capable of surviving and adapting to conditions that would destroy entire civilizations, making them either valuable allies or terrifying enemies depending on how first contact proceeded. The final recommendation in the survey report was simple but ominous, stating that humanity represented either the greatest opportunity or the greatest threat that galactic civilization had ever encountered, and that the Council's response to these Death World survivors would determine the future stability of thousands of worlds across known space. The Sekthan Empire had conquered 47 worlds, using the same efficient strategy that had never failed in 800 years of expansion, overwhelming their enemies with superior numbers and advanced technology while offering the defeated populations a simple choice between productive slavery and complete extinction. And General Lekmile expected the human colony ship Endeavor to surrender immediately when his 3,000 warriors surrounded their vessel in the empty space of the Kepler system. Colonel Matt Johnson commanded the Endeavor's defense force of 200 Marines armed with kinetic weapons and basic armor that looked primitive compared to Sekthan energy rifles and powered combat suits. But when General Lekmile transmitted the standard ultimatum demanding immediate surrender, the human response was a single word that had never been used by any species facing Sekthan military might, and that word was simply no. Battle began, with a Sekthan assault on the colony ship's docking bays, where they expected to find terrified civilians begging for mercy. But instead they encountered Marine squads that had prepared defensive positions using cargo containers and maintenance equipment, and Sergeant Katie Wells led the first counterattack using improvised explosives that eliminated an entire Sekthan assault column before they understood what was happening. What shocked the Sekthan warriors more than the human tactics was the complete absence of fear or desperation in their enemies, because humans fought with a calm determination that seemed impossible for a species facing overwhelming odds. And when Sekthan commanders offered individual humans the chance to surrender and live as slaves, every single Marine refused and continued fighting until they were killed or wounded too badly to continue. Private Alex Turner held a critical defensive position alone for 6 hours after his entire squad had been eliminated, using damaged equipment and salvaged ammunition to prevent Sekthan forces from advancing through a key corridor. And when enemy warriors finally overran his position, he activated a grenade that destroyed himself along with 6 Sekthan soldiers rather than allow them to capture him alive. The Sekthan had conquered dozens of species, but they had never encountered an enemy that seemed to prefer death over defeat. And as the battle continued for 3 days without any sign of human surrender, General Lekmile began to realize that his forces were fighting an enemy that followed completely different rules of warfare than any civilized species in the galaxy. Lisa Martinez commanded the ship's engineering section, which had been converted into a fortress using heavy machinery and power conduits as barriers, and when Sekthan forces breached the outer defenses, her team continued to fight using tools and spare parts as weapons, showing a level of adaptability and resourcefulness that confused enemies who expected engineering personnel to be non-combatants. The humans employed tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare, using suicide attacks, booby traps, and ambush strategies that made it impossible for Secton forces to predict where the next threat would come from. And they seemed to have no concept of honorable surrender or negotiated defeat, fighting until they died and making every advance cost the attackers far more than it should have. Lieutenant Ben Clark organized civilian colonists into support units that provided ammunition, medical care, and intelligence to the Marines, and the Secton discovered that human civilians were willing to die defending their ship just like the trained soldiers, showing a unity and determination that made it impossible to break their resistance. By targeting non-military personnel's casualties mounted and the battle stretched into its fourth day, General Vekmal faced a situation that no Secton commander had ever encountered, because his forces had lost nearly two-thirds of their strength while the humans showed no signs of weakening or considering surrender, and every position they captured came at such a high cost that victory was becoming meaningless. The turning point came when human defenders abandoned the outer sections of their ship and retreated to the colony areas, where they had prepared final defensive positions around the civilian quarters, and Secton forces realized that taking these areas would require them to fight through families and children who were just as determined to resist as the trained soldiers. Dr. Amy Foster, the colony's chief medical officer, had organized the hospital into a command center where wounded Marines continued to provide intelligence and tactical support, and she treated injured Secton prisoners with the same care she gave to human casualties, which confused and disturbed enemy warriors who expected their captured comrades to be tortured or executed. The final assault on the human positions revealed the truth that would haunt Secton military doctrine for generations to come, because humans fought not just for their own survival but for abstract concepts like freedom and dignity that meant more to them than their lives, and they would rather die than live under conditions that other species would accept without question. When Secton reinforcements finally arrived to support the invasion force, they found a battle that had cost them over 2,000 warriors to capture a single human ship, and General Vekmal sent an unprecedented message to his high command recommending immediate withdrawal from human space, because these enemies did not fight like any civilized species the Secton had ever encountered. The survivors of the battle told stories that spread throughout the Secton Empire and beyond, describing humans who fought until their weapons broke and then continued fighting with their bare hands, who shared their last food and water with wounded enemies, and who sang songs and told jokes even while facing certain death. The official Secton military report classified humans as a non-standard combat threat requiring new tactical doctrines, but the unofficial stories told by surviving warriors painted a picture of enemies who were either completely insane or operating according to principles that no rational species could understand, because they seemed to value ideas and relationships more than their own survival. General Vekmal's final assessment became required reading in Secton military academies, warning future commanders that humans represented a fundamental challenge to conventional warfare because they refused to accept defeat even when resistance was logically impossible, and they fought with an intensity and determination that suggested they had evolved in an environment where surrender meant death. Battle of the Endeavor marked the first time in Secton history that an invasion force had withdrawn from a weaker enemy, and the Empire's response was to immediately classify human space as a restricted zone while they studied how to deal with opponents who did not follow the established rules of galactic warfare. News of the human resistance spread throughout the galaxy, carried by Secton survivors who spoke in whispered conversations about enemies who fought like the universe itself was trying to kill them, and who seemed to consider death in battle to be preferable to any form of submission or compromise. The hegemony's efficiency calculations were precise and final when they determined that the human colony of New Virginia consumed more resources than it produced, making it economically inefficient according to the mathematical models that had governed galactic commerce for thousands of years. And Administrator Zexnol transmitted the standard relocation order, expecting the 3,000 human colonists to comply immediately with instructions to abandon their settlement and relocate to productive industrial worlds. Governor Chris Mitchell read the hegemony order with the same careful attention he gave to all official communications, but his response was delivered in the direct manner that humans used for important decisions, and he transmitted a single word back to the hegemony administrators that carried more weight and meaning than they could possibly understand, and that word was simply no, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had made an unchangeable decision the hegemony had never encountered. resistance to a relocation order in over 2,000 years of managing galactic resources, because most species understood that compliance with economic efficiency requirements was necessary for the stability and prosperity of interstellar civilization. But humans seemed to operate according to different principles that placed emotional attachment to locations above logical resource management. When Administrator Zexnol escalated the situation by dispatching enforcement Fleet Gamma with orders to relocate the colonists by force if necessary, he expected the matter to be resolved within days using standard procedures that had proven effective with every other species in the galaxy. But he had no understanding of the complex social bonds that connected humans across vast distances. Space Captain Rachel Stone received news of New Virginia's situation while commanding a cargo transport near the edge of human space, and despite having no family or business connections to the threatened colony, she immediately volunteered to organize a relief convoy, sending messages to every human ship and station within communication range and asking for volunteers to help defend people she had never met. The response to Captain Stone's call for assistance amazed even the humans who participated, because within 72 hours, dozens of ships from across known space began converging on the New Virginia system, including military escorts, converted cargo haulers, passenger transports, and private vessels whose owners had abandoned their regular duties to help complete strangers facing forced relocation. Chief Engineer Paul Wright commanded a mining ship that had been traveling toward the outer systems when he received Rachel Stone's message, and he immediately changed course toward New Virginia, even though the decision would cost him months of work and substantial financial losses, because the message had explained that humans needed help, and that was the only justification he required. Hegemony Enforcement Fleet arrived at New Virginia, expecting to process 3,000 compliant colonists using standard relocation protocols, but Admiral Zexnol found 47 human vessels of various classes arranged in defensive formation around the colony. And when he demanded to know why humans from distant worlds would risk conflict for people they had never met, the answer he received challenged every assumption about rational behavior. Lieutenant Commander Amy Brooks served as communications coordinator for the relief convoy, and when Admiral Zexnol asked for an explanation of human motivations, she transmitted a response that would be studied by xenopsychologists throughout the galaxy for generations to come, stating simply that the threatened colonists were human, and that genetic kinship created obligations that transcended distance, personal interest, and logical calculation. The standoff that followed lasted 6 days, while hegemony administrators tried to understand how a species could function when individual members would sacrifice their own welfare for the benefit of strangers, and they consulted economic models and behavioral predictions that had never accounted for the possibility that beings would act against their immediate self-interest to help others. Lisa Carter, a xenobiologist serving aboard one of the relief ships, attempted to explain human pack loyalty to confused hegemony officials by describing how humans had evolved as social animals that survived by working together and protecting all members of their group, and that this instinct had expanded to include all humans regardless of personal relationships or geographical distance. The hegemony's response was to offer individual humans substantial rewards for abandoning the defense of New Virginia, including preferred housing, advanced technology, and guaranteed employment on productive worlds. But every offer was refused by people who seemed to consider the proposal personally insulting rather than generous compensation. Captain Jake Morrison commanded a small patrol vessel that had joined the convoy despite being outgunned by any single ship in the enforcement fleet, and when hegemony negotiators asked why he would risk his ship and crew for people he would probably never see again, his answer was that humans took care of each other and that no further explanation should be necessary. The situation became more complex when other human colonies throughout the galaxy sent their own ships to support New Virginia, creating a growing fleet of vessels that represented no government or organization but simply shared the conviction that humans had the right to live where they chose regardless of economic efficiency. Calculations engineer Tim Rodriguez worked with dozens of other volunteers to improve the defensive capabilities of civilian ships, turning cargo haulers and passenger transports into makeshift warships that could provide meaningful support to the military vessels. And the hegemony observers noted with alarm that humans seemed capable of rapid improvisation and adaptation. Under pressure, when hegemony economists calculated the total cost of the human response to the New Virginia relocation order, they discovered that the resources being expended by the relief convoy far exceeded the economic value of the colony itself. which led them to conclude that humans operated according to principles that made no mathematical sense. The final negotiations took place aboard a neutral station where Admiral Zekskol met with representatives of the human relief convoy, and he attempted to explain that the hegemony's resource management policies were designed to ensure the prosperity and stability of all galactic civilizations. But the humans seemed completely uninterested in arguments based on efficiency and logic. Governor Chris Mitchell's final statement to the hegemony delegation became a defining moment in human-galactic relations, when he explained that humans would rather live poor and free than rich and controlled, and that no amount of economic prosperity was worth giving up the right to make their own decisions about where and how to live. The hegemony's withdrawal of Enforcement Fleet Gamma marked the first time in their history that they had abandoned a relocation order due to resistance from the target population, and their analysis of the incident led to the creation of new administrative categories that attempted to account for species that prioritized emotional and social bonds over economic optimization. News of the New Virginia standoff spread throughout human space and beyond, establishing a precedent that would influence galactic politics for generations to come, because it demonstrated that humans would mobilize significant resources and take substantial risks to protect the freedom and autonomy of any member of their species. The hegemony's final report on the incident recommended that future dealings with humans should account for their apparent willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for group solidarity, and that standard economic incentives and penalties might not be effective tools for managing a species that seemed to value abstract principles more than material prosperity. The collective had spent millions of years developing technology through careful analysis and systematic improvement, with each advancement tested and refined over centuries before implementation, and their quantum computer networks processed data for geological time periods to ensure that every change was perfect and safe, making them the most technologically advanced civilization in the galaxy. Through patience and methodical progress, when humanity submitted a formal request for access to collective technical databases for research purposes, the immortal machine, who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless younger species, because these short-lived organic creatures could hardly threaten technology that had been perfected over millions of years of careful development, Dr. Nancy Clark led the human research team that arrived at the collective's primary data facility, with enthusiasm and curiosity that seemed almost primitive to their hosts, asking questions about technologies that had been stable and unchanged for longer than human civilization had existed, and showing an interest in theoretical applications that the collective had dismissed as impractical or unnecessary. The first sign of trouble came when engineer Tim Rodriguez identified what he called inefficiencies in the collective's quantum communication systems, pointing out design elements that seemed unnecessarily complex and suggesting modifications that would improve performance. But the collective dismissed these observations as the naive mistakes of a species that had barely mastered interstellar travel. Within 3 months of beginning their research, the human team had compiled a list of 17 improvements to various collective technologies, ranging from minor efficiency upgrades to fundamental redesigns that could revolutionize entire fields of science, and Dr. Clark requested permission to test these modifications using collective equipment and facilities. The collective's response was predictable and swift, explaining that their technologies had been perfected through millions of years of development, and could not be improved by beings whose entire technological history spanned less than 1,000 years, and they offered to provide educational materials that would help humans understand why their suggestions were impossible or impractical. Janet Price, the human team's philosopher and social scientist, studied the collective's development methods, and discovered that their approach to innovation was fundamentally different from human problem-solving, because they spent centuries analyzing every possible outcome before making any changes, while humans developed solutions quickly and improved them through practical experience. When the human team insisted on testing their proposed improvements despite collective objections, Node 7, the facility's primary administrative intelligence, agreed to allow limited experiments as a way of demonstrating the futility of human innovation attempts, expecting the tests to fail and provide valuable lessons about the dangers of hasty technological development. The first successful test involved Tim Rodriguez's modification to quantum communication arrays, which increased transmission speed by 40% while reducing power consumption, and the results were so unexpected that the collective ran the test 17 times before accepting that a species with primitive technology had somehow improved upon their most advanced systems. Amy Foster worked with the collective's biological research division to develop new medical technologies that combined human intuition with alien scientific knowledge, and her team created treatment methods that were more effective than anything the collective had developed in thousands of years of careful medical research, using approaches that violated established principles but somehow produced better results. The success of human innovations created a crisis within the collective that threatened their fundamental understanding of technological development, because their mathematical models indicated that improvement should require extensive analysis and gradual refinement. But humans seemed capable of making breakthrough discoveries through intuition and experimental testing. Engineer Paul Wright collaborated with collective manufacturing systems to develop new production techniques that increased efficiency while reducing resource consumption, and his methods were so effective that they had to be integrated into collective operations despite violating every established principle of systematic technological advancement. The collective's attempt to understand human innovation methods led them to study human history and development patterns, and they discovered that humans had always lived under time pressure that forced them to develop working solutions quickly rather than perfect solutions slowly, because survival on their hostile homeworld required immediate adaptation to changing conditions. Dr. Lisa Martinez focused her research on transportation systems and developed faster-than-light travel methods that combined human engineering intuition with collective theoretical knowledge, creating spacecraft designs that were impossible according to established physics but somehow worked better than anything the galaxy had seen before. When the collective analyzed the mathematical foundations of human innovations, they discovered that humans often ignored theoretical limitations and focused on practical results, testing ideas that should not work according to existing scientific models but somehow produced beneficial outcomes that expanded the boundaries of known science. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Nancy Clark's team demonstrated that human innovation speed was not limited by the complexity of the technology involved, because they could improve systems they barely understood by applying general problem-solving principles and experimental methods that bypassed the need for complete theoretical knowledge. Evans' report to the Collective High Council described the Human Research Project as a fundamental challenge to their civilization's basic assumptions about technological development, because these organic beings had achieved in months what should have required millennia of careful analysis and systematic improvement. The collective's response was to classify human innovation methods as a potential threat to galactic stability, because if other species adopted human approaches to technological development, the careful balance of power and knowledge that had maintained peace for millions of years could be disrupted in unpredictable ways. Dr. Janet Price's final analysis of the situation explained that humans had evolved under conditions that rewarded quick thinking and rapid adaptation over careful planning and systematic analysis, making them naturally suited to innovation under pressure, but potentially dangerous to civilizations that had achieved stability through methodical progress. The human research team's departure from the collective facility marked the end of the most successful technology transfer program in galactic history, but it also marked the beginning of widespread concern about humanity potential to disrupt the established order through their unconventional approach to scientific and technological development. The collective's final assessment recommended that humanity be closely monitored to prevent their innovation methods from spreading to other species, because the rapid technological advancement that humans seemed to take for granted could destabilize civilizations that had spent millions of years achieving perfect balance through careful, systematic progress. News of human technological achievements spread throughout the galaxy despite the collective's attempts to limit information distribution, and species that had been content with gradual improvement for millennia began to question whether there might be better ways to approach scientific research and technological development. The emergency session of the Galactic Council drew representatives from every major civilization across known space, filling the ancient assembly chamber with beings who had never before gathered to discuss a single species, and the tension in the room was evident as delegates whispered among themselves about the unprecedented disruption that humanity had caused to galactic civilization in less than 2 years since First Contact. Counselor Veth Prime of the Zephyrians opened the session by presenting a comprehensive analysis of human activities throughout Council space, documenting rescue operations that violated standard protocols, military actions that defied conventional warfare principles, economic decisions that ignored logical resource management, and technological innovations that challenged millions of years of established scientific progress, the sect and military delegation provided detailed reports of their encounters with human forces, describing combat tactics that seemed designed by beings who had no concept of honorable defeat or civilized surrender. And General Kethnal explained that human warriors fought with an intensity and determination that suggested they had evolved in an environment where compromise meant death. Ambassadors ex-primi of the hegemony presented economic analyses showing that human colonies consistently prioritized freedom and autonomy over efficiency and productivity, making them impossible to manage using the resource optimization systems that had maintained galactic prosperity for thousands of years. And he warned that human ideas about individual rights could spread to other species and destabilize the entire economic structure. The collective's representative, Node 7, delivered the most disturbing report of all, explaining that humans had improved upon technologies that had been perfected over millions of years of careful development, and that their innovation methods could revolutionize galactic science in ways that might be impossible to control or predict. A counselor, Thekmore of the Healing Guild, expressed concern that humanity's influence was already spreading to other species, with some civilizations beginning to question established protocols and procedures that had maintained peace and stability throughout the galaxy for countless generations. And he warned that human concepts of individual worth and personal freedom could undermine the social structures that held galactic civilization together. The debate that followed revealed the depth of fear and confusion that humanity had created among species that had grown comfortable with predictable patterns of behavior and development, because humans seemed to operate according to principles that made no sense to civilizations that had achieved stability through careful adherence to established rules and procedures. Ambassador Susan Kelly stood alone before the assembled representatives of 47 species, her small human form dwarfed by the massive chamber and the hundreds of alien delegates who watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility, and she began her response with a simple directness that had become humanity's trademark. In galactic affairs, she acknowledged that humans were indeed different from other species in the galaxy, but she challenged the assumption that difference necessarily meant danger, explaining that humanity had developed its unique characteristics through millions of years of evolution on a world that required constant adaptation and cooperation. For survival, her explanation of human pack loyalty confused many delegates, who could not understand why beings would sacrifice their own welfare for the benefit of strangers. But Susan described it as a natural extension of the cooperation that had allowed humans to survive on a hostile world where individual success was impossible without group support. When Councillor Veth Prim argued that human unpredictability made them too dangerous to integrate into galactic civilization, Susan pointed out that the galaxy's current stability was based on stagnation, and that many species had stopped growing and developing because they were afraid of change, while humans continued to evolve and adapt because they had never learned to accept limitations as permanent. The accusation that humans violated established warfare principles prompted Suzanne to ask whether those principles had been designed to minimize casualties and protect innocent beings, or simply to make conquest more predictable and manageable for established powers. And she suggested that human combat methods were more ethical because they focused on protecting the weak rather than maintaining the status quo. Her response to economic criticism was equally direct, pointing out that the hegemony's efficiency calculations treated intelligent beings as resources to be managed rather than individuals with rights and desires. And she argued that human economic decisions prioritized the welfare of people over the optimization of systems because they believed that civilizations should serve their citizens rather than the other way around. When the collective's concerns about technological disruption were raised, Susan acknowledged that humans approached innovation differently than other species, but she suggested that their methods produced better results because they were willing to take risks and learn from failures rather than spending centuries avoiding any possibility of making mistakes. The most powerful moment of her address came when she challenged the Council's fundamental assumptions about progress and stability, pointing out that many of the galaxy's supposedly advanced civilizations had stopped growing and developing thousands of years ago, and that their current systems were designed to prevent change rather than promote improvement. She concluded by acknowledging that humanity would never fit perfectly into the existing structure of galactic civilization, but she argued that this was an opportunity rather than a problem, because humans could help other species rediscover the courage to grow and change and explore new possibilities that had been abandoned in favor of safe predictability. The silence that followed Susan's address lasted for several minutes as delegates struggled to process ideas that challenged their most basic assumptions about civilized behavior and social organization, and many species that had been content with gradual decline began to question whether stability was worth the cost of stagnation. The final vote took place after 3 days of debate and consultation, with each species weighing the potential benefits and risks of accepting humanity into galactic civilization, and the result was unprecedented in Council history because it created a new classification that had never been needed before. Humanity was granted provisional membership with the designation of uncontained species, meaning they would be allowed to participate in galactic affairs but would not be subject to the standard restrictions and protocols that governed other civilizations. Because the Council recognized that human nature made traditional management impossible, the decision represented a fundamental shift in galactic politics, acknowledging for the first time that diversity of thought and approach might be more valuable than uniformity of behavior, and that the galaxy's long period of stable stagnation might need to end if civilizations were going to continue growing and developing. As Ambassador Susan Kelly left the council chambers, she transmitted a simple message back to Earth that would mark the beginning of a new era in galactic history, telling her species that they had been accepted into the galactic community and that it was time to show the universe what humans could accomplish. When they were free to be themselves, the galaxy would indeed never be the same, because humanity had forced every other species to confront the possibility that there might be better ways to live and grow and explore the universe than the safe and predictable methods they had followed for millions of years.